On April 15th last year at about 2:50 in the afternoon, chaos exploded in Boston. It just so happened that Dr. and Mrs. Kahn were in Boston that day, so all the chaos took on more of a personal meaning for our campus. The Boston Marathon, one of the greatest sporting events in the world, had been going on for just over 4 hours, 2 hours after the winners had finished the race. With over 5,600 runners pushing to complete the marathon and tens of thousands of people waiting for them to finish, 2 homemade bombs detonated near the finish line. There was a 27-year-old guy waiting there to celebrate with his girlfriend when she finished the race. His name is Jeff Ballman. You can see him and his girlfriend, Erin Hurley, on the screen. Now, imagine in that moment what Jeff's experiencing. He's standing at the finish line of a grueling marathon, straining to look over everyone's head, pushing in to the barricade just to get a glimpse of the woman he loves running down the street. His heart's racing. He's breathing hard. He can't wait to give Erin a big hug and help tend to her needs. But in an instant, when that first bomb exploded, Jeff thought he was going to die. There's another man standing near the finish line of the marathon. His name is Carlos Arredondo. He's famous for his cowboy hat. He didn't have any family members running in the race. He was there for another reason that was 10 years in the making. On his 44th birthday in 2004, some government vehicles rolled into his driveway. Now, his 20-year-old son, Alex, had been serving in Iraq. And Carlos thought it was one of those great things. You know, you see these things at ball games and commercials and all that stuff. And he thought it was a surprise visit by Alex for his birthday. Instead, Marine officers got out of the vehicle, told Carlos that Alex had been shot by an enemy sniper while he was checking on his men. Carlos understandably lost control. He grabbed a sledgehammer and smashed the windshield of one of the vans. He then poured gasoline on the van and on himself, and he lit a torch, causing an explosion. By the time that the Marines could save him, he had severely burnt 26% of his body. He attended his son's funeral on a stretcher with paramedics on either side. After almost a year of recovery, Carlos and his wife, the stepmother to Alex and his younger brother Brian, started to travel the country to promote peace. Unfortunately, Carlos's younger son, Brian, had trouble dealing with his brother's death and how his father reacted to it. Brian battled depression and drug addiction, and unfortunately, ultimately took his own life in 2011 when he was just 24. Obviously, Carlos went through a dark time. He had lost both sons, one to combat, one to suicide. And despite struggling with his own depression, he continued as a peace activist and worked to prevent suicide. He and his wife were at the Boston Marathon that day to cheer on members of the National Guard who were running in memory of fallen soldiers. One of the guardsmen was running in memory of their son, Alex. They also were there to support a group of women called the Samaritans, who were running to promote suicide prevention efforts. Carlos thought that he and his wife were there to support just their sons, to remember their sons, and to raise awareness for these suicide prevention efforts and to help military families in need. But Carlos was there to help Jeff Ballman, a guy he hadn't met until the afternoon of the Boston Marathon bombings. Jeff Ballman was on the side of the street where the bombs went off in a group of people. Carlos Arredondo was on the other side of the street passing out American flags. When the first bomb went off, Carlos was frightened, and then he looked across the street, and where there were people earlier, there were no more people through the cloud of smoke. What did Carlos do after the second bomb went off? He said he couldn't but help think about his sons who were gone. Instead of running away, Carlos, who is a Catholic, made the sign of the cross, asked God to protect everyone, and he ran to the carnage. You can see him in his hat among the injured people on the screen. After he saw an injured young woman, he saw a young man who was hurt more seriously. This young man was Jeff Ballman. Both of Jeff's legs had been blown off below the knees. Carlos told Jeff, hey, listen, don't move. Help's coming, I'm going to get help. Amazingly, Jeff's t-shirt was still on fire. And Carlos, who had already been burned over 26% of his body, put out the fire with his hands. Carlos then ripped a person's t-shirt to make a tourniquet to tie around Jeff's right leg because of the massive bleeding. Another person there tied a shoelace around Jeff's left leg to stop the bleeding there. Carlos and a few others helped Jeff get into a wheelchair and rushed him to a medical tent. And one of the most iconic images from the bombings is when Carlos runs alongside Jeff in the wheelchair. The piece of fabric that he had used as a tourniquet kept getting caught in the wheel. Carlos ran, holding the cloth to make sure it stayed on Jeff's leg. Once they got to the medical tent, Carlos picked Jeff up out of the wheelchair and put him in the ambulance. In an interview that Carlos did after the marathon, a reporter asked him what he thought about this whole ordeal. Catch what Carlos says. God put me in a path where I was supposed to do what I did to help others and to honor my sons. Thank God he gave me the strength to help others. Absolutely amazing. This man who had lost so much was able to be a part of saving people's lives instead of standing on the other side of the street, mourning and grieving, and instead of running from the devastation. But Jeff wasn't out of the woods. He had 2 life-saving surgeries, during which he required multiple resuscitations. These surgeries were to amputate his legs above the knee. When he woke up days later, he knew he'd struggle at best to walk with prosthetic legs. But he had a huge secret. And here's how one reporter put it. When Jeff awoke days later from hours of surgery, rather than take stock of his now completely altered life, Jeff ripped out his breathing tube and tried to speak. He couldn't. Jeff asked for a pad and paper and he wrote down 7 words. Saw the guy, looked right at me, setting off one of the biggest manhunts in the country's history and beginning his own brave road to recovery. Jeff had seen one of the suspected bombers and was able to help identify him. Now, while the story is already pretty amazing, there's more. Jeff and Carlos are both heroes for what they did. And their personal stories went on to inspire the entire city of Boston, really the entire nation and people around the world. There's a monthly magazine that they print in the city, and it's simply called Boston. Right after the bombings, the magazine staff was trying to determine how to cover what happened, and hundreds of shoes had been left at the finish line. They decided to gather them all up and arrange them for a cover for the May issue. The cover was inspirational, and it captured the essence of the city's response. Take a look at it on the screen. Shoes. In the middle of the image are the words, "We will finish the race." Now, since the bombings, the city has embraced a mantra that has served as a theme for everyone to move forward through the pain. This phrase is Boston Strong. Now, both Jeff and Carlos appeared at a Boston Red Sox game, at a Boston Bruins game, as the men who embodied Boston Strong. And here's a picture of Jeff and Carlos at the Red Sox game to throw out the ceremonial first pitch. The Red Sox went on to win the World Series and helped the city rally together last fall. I got to be honest with you, I'm not a real big Red Sox fan, but I am a baseball fan, and what happened with the Red Sox last year was beyond inspirational. We're Boston Strong. You can't stop us, and regardless of what you do to us, we will move forward. Now, this story was so captivating that President Obama invited Jeff and Carlos to the State of the Union address in January. Here's a picture of them that night with Michelle Obama. They're in the upper left corner, they're hugging like old friends. On that day, Jeff tweeted the following: "I wore pants for the first time in 9 months. And I also met the president." It's kind of interesting. He also announced that he'll be releasing a book, actually on April 8th this year, just in time for the Boston Marathon. An image of the book's cover is on the screen. The title is simply Stronger. At the top of the cover, you can't read it, but let me tell you what it says. I saw the bomber, he took my legs, but he didn't break me. He only made me stronger. This story is so full of stuff to help us live, but I want to focus on one idea. Jeff could have become bitter. Carlos had every reason in the world to be bitter. The entire city of Boston could have embraced bitterness. But Jeff, Carlos, and the people of Boston let us know that we have a choice in the matter. Perhaps you've heard the famous line from Nietzsche. What does not kill me makes me stronger. Well, I think these guys took it a step further. What does not kill me makes us stronger. Ultimately, we have a choice when bad things happen. Grudges or greatness. We see a story with a lot of similarities in the book of Genesis. Joseph was a man who knew suffering. He was a victim of some of the most famous sibling rivalry of all time. Now, perhaps some of us in this room know something about that, or at least great drama with our siblings. I grew up with a brother 3 years older than me and a sister 3 years younger, and she was the baby of the family. That, coupled with the fact that she was the only girl, set her up for some cruel and unusual punishment from her two loving older brothers. My brother and I were master button pushers. It didn't take long for us to pester our sister to drive her to our mom. And my mom, knowing full well that my brother and I enjoyed using our spiritual gifts to help our sister struggle more with her self-esteem, often sided with my sister, and I might add, rightfully so. Now, when we really got under my sister's skin, our mom had this unique tool in her discipline repertoire. Now, mind you, I would have rather have been beaten by a switch. By a log. Or I would have rather been grounded for like 20 years. When we had really annoyed my sister, she'd run to my mom, and of course she'd rat us out. And it'd take about a second or two. Some of y'all know what I'm about to talk about. And then I'd wait for this, Michael Allen? Now, you know when your parents use both names, the fight's on. It's a battle cry. And I always responded the same way in these moments. My mind would always automatically gravitate to one thought. I believe I'd like to be put up for adoption right now. Seriously, my mom had this thing where she would tell my sister and me, okay, you have to hug each other. Not only do you have to hug each other, you have to tell each other that you love each other. And then you have to tell each other that you're sorry. Well, I finally figured out a way to kind of work on this, but I was really concerned about being obedient to my mom and lying because I didn't very much love my sister in those moments. And honestly, I didn't feel sorry. But I finally figured out a way to preserve my young integrity. Plus, my approach had an element of bugging my sister even more. I would go up to my sister like this. I love you and I'm sorry. Now, before I pulled away from her from that wonderful, loving embrace, I would say as I'm pulling away artfully, I don't mean it. Okay, now imagine this. She's crying to mom. Mom, he said he didn't mean it. But by that time, man, I was off. It was great. Fantastic sibling rivalry moments. I'm sure that you guys have some of your own. But my sibling rivalry experiences were a joke compared to Joseph's. Joseph, the 11th son of Jacob, whom God renamed Israel later. The Bible is clear that Joseph was Jacob's favorite. Joseph was the 11th. Jacob had 10 sons before Joseph, all by different women, at least 3 different women, but finally he had Joseph, who was the son from Rachel, the woman he really loved. And Jacob, as many of us know, made Joseph this wonderful coat of many colors, and it showed him how special he was. But this didn't set well with the brothers. And Joseph also, as we know, had this gift of interpreting dreams, and he told his brother these 2 dreams, and in these 2 dreams they bowed down to him. And not only these things, but the Bible is clear. It says Joseph was handsome. Joseph had it going on. So with all these things, it finally got to the brothers. and they decided that they're going to kill him. They're going to kill Joseph at age 17. But after rethinking their plans, they decided to just put him in a pit instead of killing him, and they ultimately sell him into slavery for 20 pieces of silver. They stripped him of the beautiful coat, they covered it with goat's blood, and they took it back to their father, and their father was crushed. He thought his favorite son was dead. And the people who now own Joseph took him to Egypt. Now things couldn't have gotten much worse. I mean, let's remember context here. Egypt and slavery. He was purchased by a man named Potiphar, the chief of Pharaoh's bodyguard. Joseph worked hard and he earned the position of running Potiphar's entire estate. But at some point, Potiphar's wife got attracted to Joseph and kept coming on to him. Joseph rebuffed it every time, but one day everybody else was gone. Joseph and Potiphar's wife were alone. She comes on to him again. He runs away, and as he's running away, she grabs his garment. He's running away, naked or half naked, and she screams that he had raped her. He was then placed in a dungeon in prison, but Joseph doesn't buckle. In fact, we read that he was given responsibility for the entire jail. And for some reason we don't know, Pharaoh's chief baker and his cupbearer were thrown in prison as well. They both had dreams that, guess what? Joseph interpreted. When they were released just days later, Joseph asked them, please remember me, I'd like to get out of here. But no one helped until 2 years later, when Pharaoh had a dream and none of his advisors could interpret it. So what happened? The cupbearer tells Pharaoh about Joseph, and as a result, Pharaoh summoned Joseph, and he comes up and he tells him what the dream's about. Pharaoh's dream said that there would be 7 years of plenty and 7 years of famine. And because of Joseph's work, thousands of lives were saved within Egypt, and thousands more outside of Egypt were saved because they came to get their food there. Joseph was sold into slavery when he was 17. There might be a few people in this crowd who are 17. Joseph was sold into slavery at 17. He was appointed by Pharaoh when he was 30. This means that he was a slave for 13 years, and many of those years he's in prison. And when the famine became so bad, Jacob sent his 10 oldest sons to buy grain in Egypt. And guess what? Of course, we know Joseph is there. When the brothers come, Joseph recognizes them, but they don't recognize him. They didn't even have an idea if he was still alive. And the story reaches a beautiful moment in Genesis chapter 45. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all of his attendants, and he cried out, "Have everyone leave my presence." So there was no one with Joseph when he made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard him, and Pharaoh's household heard about it. Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still living?" But his brothers were not able to answer him because they were terrified at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come close to me." When they had done so, he said, "I am your brother Joseph, the one you sold into Egypt. And now do not," this blows my mind, "and now do not be distressed or do not be angry with yourselves for selling me here, because it was to save lives that God sent me ahead of you. For 2 years now there has been a famine in the land, and for the next 5 years there will be no plowing and reaping. But God sent me ahead of you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. He made me father to Pharaoh, lord of his entire household, and ruler of all Egypt. Now hurry back to my father and say to him, 'This is what your son Joseph says.' Surprise, he's alive. 'God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, don't delay. You shall live in the region of Goshen and be near me, you, your children and grandchildren, your flocks and herds, and all you have. I will provide for you there because 5 years of famine are still to come. Otherwise you and your household and all who belong to you will become desolate.'" There's so much great stuff here, but let's look at how Joseph responds to what's going on. He's not angry. He's not vengeful. He's not looking for pity. He's not waiting around with a list of reasons to explain to them why they jacked up his life. He's not trying to schedule an appearance with Dr. Phil. He's not holding a grudge. Instead, there's one thing he says 3 times, and it might just blow our theology. Listen to how he expresses this thought in verse 8. So then, it was not you who sent me here, but God. Think about this. 13 years a slave. Many of those years in prison. Separation from his family for more than 20 years. He thought his father was dead, and he said, it was not you who sent me here, but God. Now the story progresses on to Genesis 50, after Joseph finally sees his father and his younger brother. His father eventually dies, and we pick up things in Genesis 50:15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, what if Joseph holds a grudge against us and pays us back for all the wrongs we did to him? So they sent word to Joseph saying, your father left these instructions before he died. This is what you are to say to Joseph. I ask you to forgive your brothers the sins and the wrongs they committed in treating you so badly. Now please, forgive the sins of the servants of the God your father. When their message came to him, Joseph wept. His brothers then came and threw themselves down before him. We are your slaves, they said. But Joseph said to them, don't be afraid. Am I in the place of God? You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. So then don't be afraid. I will provide for you and your children. And he reassured them and spoke kindly to them. The key for us today is in verse 20. Unfortunately, I think we've allowed verse 20 to become cheap bumper sticker theology. In fact, I'm not even sure we read the whole verse. Many of us could quote the words, what you intended for harm, God intended for good, period. The problem is that stops short, and it winds up being a bit self-serving. We're quick to think that God works everything out for my good. Instead, when we understand the whole expression in verse 20, our painful experiences take on a whole new meaning for God's kingdom. Verse 20 echoes what we read earlier in Genesis 25 or 45. In Genesis 45, Joseph tells his brother, you didn't send me here, God sent me here. Slavery, Egypt, bondage, oh my goodness, evil accusations. And now we read in Genesis 50, you intended to harm me, God intended it for good, and he intended it for good so he might work out his purpose, the saving of many lives. Joseph was sold into slavery by his family. He was abandoned, he was abused, he was falsely accused of rape. He was left in jail to rot. He had every reason to be bitter. But just like Jeff Ballman and Carlos Arredondo, Joseph made choices to not hold a grudge. And just like Jeff and Carlos, he made choices to achieve greatness. In fact, God used Joseph to save thousands of lives, including his families, as a result of all the bad stuff. So what does all this mean for us? How many of us here have been deeply hurt? Perhaps we're carrying a bunch of family baggage. Maybe we feel abandoned by the people who are supposed to protect us. Maybe our friends have stabbed us in the back. Some of us here have been abused. Maybe we've been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Maybe we feel like we're in some kind of prison. Perhaps we're even sitting here suffering from our own screw-ups. We're expecting self-destructive behaviors to somehow make us feel better, but they do so only for a brief time. And God knows I've struggled with so many things on this list. But to put it in our language today, we find ourselves in Egypt. But we can learn how to deal with our Egypts from Joseph. And here's the key point for us today. When we read, you intended to harm me, God intended all this stuff for good, and he's now working his purpose, the saving of many lives. We have to realize who said that. I think a lot of us are kind of on autopilot. We think maybe God said that, or the person who wrote Genesis said that, inspired by the Holy Spirit. The person who said that was Joseph. He didn't wait for God to come down and fix everything. He realized that he wasn't some passive victim to suffer forever because of all the bad stuff that had happened to him. He never made it about himself. He didn't wallow around in self-pity. He didn't embrace rage and resentment. And we have to stress this too. He never denied all the bad stuff that happened to him. In fact, there are several instances in this story where he breaks down and cries bitterly. But he didn't wait to get out of Egypt to do something about his situation. Regardless of how he was treated, in spite of unfair and erroneous accusations, even though he was rejected, abandoned, abused, maligned, and forgotten, he refused to become resentful or succumb to bitterness or to bear a grudge. Instead, he understood that he had to be an active participant in the process of good that God wanted to accomplish. Here's what we have to learn from Joseph. We don't need to deny the bad stuff that's happened to us, but we can never allow that to become a permanent state of self-absorption. Perhaps it's not about waiting for God to come down and make everything perfect. Instead, while we're in the middle of our personal Egypts, we can choose to move beyond self-pity and rage and resentment. We don't have to wait until we're out of Egypt to do something great. We can't wait to do something until everything around us is perfect. It'll never be perfect. We don't have to let Egypt define us. In fact, God can use our experiences to bring the greatness out of all of us in the land that we think is our bondage. We have to come to the same realization as Joseph. We must be active participants in the process of good that God wants to accomplish, just like Joseph. Perhaps Martin Luther King Jr. captured the essence of our thought today the best, as he was working harder and harder to make civil rights a reality. He and his family received a great deal of threats, as we know. They indeed suffered for the cause. He said this in a sermon years before his assassination. As my sufferings mounted, I soon realized that there were two ways in which I could respond to my situation: either to react with bitterness or seek to transform the suffering into a creative force. I decided to follow the latter course. And we know his choice has affected countless lives for decades. No grudges, just greatness. Everything we've talked about today is important for us to move beyond grudges to pursue greatness. But at the core of all this is the challenge of forgiveness. Jeff Ballman, Carlos Arredondo, and Joseph refused to allow the lack of forgiveness to dictate their lives. The lack of forgiveness is a lot like a bungee run. You run like crazy. You think you're making progress. It feels like you're getting away from the pain of the past. It might even feel like you're finally happy again. Then all of a sudden, the bungee cord snaps you right back to the grudge. But only when we cut the bungee cord can we move forward. Jeff, Carlos, Joseph, all of them did it. And we have the same choice. Unfortunately, I think there's a great deal of misunderstanding about forgiveness. Does it mean that we forget what happened to us? No. Does it mean that we forgive just once and move on? No, I don't think life works that way. It doesn't work that way, particularly when you're hurt deeply. Does it mean that we allow ourselves to get victimized again? No. Here's what forgiveness means. Forgiveness means to cancel the debt. Forgiveness means that we don't try to make people pay for how they hurt us anymore. Perhaps it means that we have to cancel the debt every day when we're reminded of the hurt. We all know how hard it is to just kind of leave it in the past and move on. It's not that we're supposed to never think about the hurt again. We just need to keep canceling the desire to collect on what we think others owe us. I've had the privilege of working with a wonderful student leader for the past year. And it's safe to say that she spent a few years in her personal Egypt. She's recently begun to leave the grudges behind and really to step into realizing her greatness. We had the opportunity to meet a few weeks ago about the ideas that I'm talking about today. I wanted to bounce them off of her. And she graciously agreed to write a journal to kind of talk about her journey through Egypt. She's also agreed to let me share it today with you in the spirit of defining her Egypt instead of allowing Egypt to define her. In the same sense as Jeff, Carlos, and Joseph, she wants her stuff to make you stronger. She's learning to be an active participant in the good that God is wanting to do, not just in her life, but in all of ours. Here's what she wrote. I remember the exact moment I really saw my true condition. I was driving past Tres Hermanos on Ocoee Street, and I thought to myself, I feel so numb. This can't be what living is supposed to feel like. Why did I feel this way? Past relationship mistakes, maybe, because there are definitely a lot of those. Maybe I was frustrated trying to be a perfect Christian, an overcommitted student leader on campus, a good girl to the parents, and a tough girl to my friends and my roommates. So many scenarios came to mind, but I thought with Christ I was supposed to be free. I had a glimpse of my condition that day, but I chose to ignore my signs of dormancy. I pushed the thoughts aside and buried them, telling myself, I'm fine. There came a point this semester when I was sitting in my armchair staring at my personal prison, my very own desert that I had been living in, one that I could no longer hide. I had a choice to make. I could remain secretly detesting myself for my past mistakes. I could choose to continue, catch this, tearing myself into different people depending on the circumstances. I could strive, yearn, and claw my way to gain acceptance and love from people. I could remain bitter at my dad, who never seemed to be around enough. Or I could change. I had choices. Actually, lots of choices. And I still have choices. I'm choosing to make those choices every day. Just acknowledging my issues wasn't enough. And even choosing the right response once is only the first step. I am daily, hourly reminding myself that my worth isn't tied to what I have done, good or bad. I remind myself that no matter how good it feels when people accept me, acceptance from people waxes and wanes. This change is a choice to learn to redefine where I get my confidence and identity. This choice wasn't just deciding to forgive those who had wronged me or even learning to forgive myself, but a decision to really change. The chapel band is going to sing a song simply called Forgiveness. The words will be displayed on the screen for you to reflect on and process as they sing. Grudges or greatness? You decide.